to be addressing you. This has been titled an expert talk. By no stretch of imagination am I an expert in this topic. Well, I do have the benefit of having worked or being connected to all the three organs of government, whether it's the executive or the legislative or the judiciary. So I think that gives me a good space to share my views on this very important topic. Uh, I'm before I begin the topic, let me tell you that I'm a huge votary of public policy education. It's a fairly nascent field in our country, as you know, but particularly in the US. Almost all the Ivy Leagues and all the top universities in the US have robust public policy curriculum and courses. In Asia, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy is a great school. The beauty of public policy is that it is an interdisciplinary field, drawing from the fields of law, management, international relations, psychology, political science, history, to name a few. In fact, the new education policy, NEP 2020, is one of the finest examples of sound public policy because it lays huge stress on interdisciplinary learning, and I think has been well, it is yet to be tested, but at least on the policy side, on the the policy formulation side, it has been I think a great example of sound public policy, and I think it will address to a great extent one of the biggest challenges of India's education system, which is very unidimensional in its approach, and which manifests in our work culture and also in the area of public policy. So I think the NEP 2020 being one of the finest examples of learning. So now let's jump into the topic, which
Sujit sir, may I interrupt you here? I think we are all telling in the chat that voice is not clear.
I think he's dropped out.
Yeah.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
We can see you, sir.
Can you hear me as well?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I think the connection is unstable. So I'm sorry. My apologies. Okay. So the topic judicial activism and public policy. In public policy, we need to be very clear about the fundamental question of who makes policies. So policy, no doubt, is predominantly made by the legislative wing of the government and executed by the executive wing. And the judiciary has the task of interpreting the policy using the touchstone and the yardstick of the Constitution and the principles of natural justice. This is the doctrine of separation of power, which most of you, or probably all of you, will be aware of, which clearly stipulates, that each of the organs of the government has a certain role and is expected to perform that role, and also is expected to exercise self-restraint and not encroach upon the turf or the territory of the other organ of the government. So this is where the topic of judicial activism, comes into the picture. Whether there is something called judicial activism, some people call it even judicial adventurism, judicial overreach, judicial aggression. Should it happen? Should it? And if the answer is yes, there is judicial activism or even judicial overreach or adventurism. Should it be happening in a democracy? So these are some of the areas that we'll be talking about, and I would also like to make a clear distinction between judicial activism and judicial aggression. Right? Um, it's a fact that oftentimes we have read, we have seen that the judiciary oversteps, or is at least perceived or is at least accused to overstep into the domains of policy making, which is the territory of legislature and to some extent the executive, and this is called judicial activism. The Constitution of India doesn't define what judicial activism is, but there are jurists, eminent jurists who have spoken about judicial activism, some in positive way, some in a neutral way, and some in a negative way. So I would like to quote the eminent jurist Professor Upendra Bakshi. He describes judicial activism as the way of exercising judicial powers, which seeks fundamental recodification of powers relations among the dominant institutions of the state, manned by the members of the ruling class. Justice J.S. Verma, as you all know, one of the finest judges of the Apex Court, former judges of our Apex Court, he describes judicial activism to mean the process of implementation of the rule of law, essential for the preservation of a functional democracy. And in one of the landmark judgments, S.P. Gupta versus Union of India, he has held that the judge has to inject flesh and blood in the dry skeleton provided by the legislature. And by a process of dynamic interpretation, mark the words, by a process of dynamic interpretation, invest it with a meaning which will harmonize the law with the prevailing concepts and values and make it an effective instrument for delivery of justice. Make it an effective instrument for delivery of justice. Right. The judiciary in almost all common law jurisdiction and ADIC common law jurisdiction, judiciary not only interprets the legislation or the public policy, but we must ask the fundamental question: interpret public policy to what end? The ultimate end is to protect the fundamental rights of the citizens. The ultimate end is to ensure that the common citizens of our country are able to access or able to have access to justice. So the end is justice, the end is protection of our fundamental rights. So that is why when the judiciary is asked or is tasked to interpret the Constitution of India, the touchstone of fundamental rights enshrined in our Constitution in Part 4, starting from Article 14, right to equality, to Article 32, the constitutional remedies, and the touchstone of fairness, equity, and justice. These are the fundamental touchstones on which judiciary interprets any legislation or any executive action. Right. So this has to be very, very clear. Now, so the question of judicial activism is closely related to constitutional interpretation. It's not because of a personal whim or fancy of an individual judge, but judicial activism has close linkages to constitutional interpretation, to our statutory separation of powers as enshrined in our constitution. I think some of you or most of you would have heard of the concept of basic structure, which was articulated in the landmark Kesavanand Bharati judgment of 1973. I would strongly urge all of you to read the judgment. It is one of the finest articulations of jurisprudence. So you may not be a lawyer yourself, you may not be very very much associated with the legal and the judicial field, but as students of public policy and as aware citizens, I think everyone should read the Kesavan Bharti judgment. So in that judgment, a 13-judge bench described what is called the basic structure. So prior to that, the government had the power to amend the Indian Constitution, including the fundamental rights, including various other pretty much every part of the Constitution using Article 368. In the case of Anand Bharti, the Supreme Court said no. There are certain parts of the Constitution which are not amendable even by using Article 368. And the Supreme Court called such parts of the Constitution the basic structure. For example, the fundamental rights. The Supreme Court said no, even during an emergency, okay, or under no circumstances can the fundamental rights of a citizen be taken away, or the citizen may be deprived of his or her fundamental rights under no circumstances, except by following the due process of law. So separation of powers is also described as one of the basic structure, federal structure of our Constitution. Okay, right to vote, the secular nature of our country, Republican nature of our country, parliamentary democracy. These are all parts of the basic structure. So separation of power between the three organs also is taken as part of the basic structure. Which brings me back to this question of judicial activism. So having enshrined the concept of basic structure, is the Supreme Court now exceeding its assigned power under the Indian constitutional framework, and thereby violating the basic structure, right? So we will come to some of this coalition. I would seek your opinion. Now, there are jurists who have described judicial activism, who have developed the theories of judicial activism, and they say that a lot of you might ask, or a lot of you might be wondering why is the judiciary in the first place acting and encroaching upon the territory of the legislature. After all, we are a democracy. So it is the elected members of the assemblies and the parliament, the MPs and the MLAs, who are tasked with designing public policy. And the executive, whether it's the civil service or the ministers or the cabinet, they are tasked with implementing those policies, right? And judiciary at best is to see whether those policies are in consonance with our constitution. That's it. Now, some jurists have argued that the theory, there are two theories at least which I'm aware of. One is called the theory of vacuum filling. This theory states that there cannot be a power vacuum, right? And when the governance structure or the governance system is inactive or lazy, okay, then the vacuum is created due to this inactivity or incompetence or corruption or for any other reason, laziness. And to safeguard the public interest and to protect the democratic structure of our country, to protect the democratic institutions, judiciary becomes extra vigilant and steps in to fill this vacuum. Okay, we have seen this. If you, I do not want to take political sides here, but I mean, there's a lot of judicial activism or talk of judicial activism during the UPA 2 between 2009 to 14. You had a lot of scams, that a lot of skeletons tumbling out of the UPA cupboard, 2G scam, coal scam, telecoms, and so on and so forth. So judiciary became extra vigilant, judiciary became extra active, right? And the second theory of judicial activism is called the theory of social want. When the legislature or the executive fails to fulfill the wants and needs of the citizens, then judiciary steps in. Classic example could be the pollution in Delhi. So it was widely felt that the government was not doing enough to check pollution in Delhi, which had reached alarming proportions. So judiciary, banned bursting of crackers during Diwali, or even prior to that, made it mandated that every commercial vehicle in the city or in NCR has to have CNG, right? And so on and so forth. So these are the theories of judicial activism. Now, I have my own views. I think despite the justifications, I think judicial activism is a slippery slope. No, well, I am definitely cognizant of the massive role that the judiciary has played in shaping a public policy in the country. If I were to take a benign view of this judicial activism, I agree that judiciary has stepped in only when the policy implementers or the policy designers are found lacking. So I would like to quote Mr. Venugopal, who is now the Attorney General of India and one of the doyens of Indian legal profession, and he has in one of the lectures said, and I would like to quote him: through judicial activism, the Supreme Court has done a tremendous amount of good. Through judicial activism, the Supreme Court has done a tremendous amount of good. It has practically tried to wipe away every tears of the underprivileged, disadvantaged, and illiterate sections of society. These are strong words coming from Mr. Venugopal. Now, I wouldn't go that far. I think yes, there have been instances where judiciary certainly, and there were enough justifications for judiciary to be active or to be extra vigilant. And I gave the example of the CNG in public transport in and around Delhi, the PIL jurisdiction, which I'll talk about briefly, with Justice P.N. Bhagwati and Justice Krishna Nayak pioneered and literally transformed the arena of public policy in the 1970s and 80s. Article 21 literally transformed. So right to clean air, right to clean drinking water, right to shelter, right to dignified living, right to livelihood. Everything was brought under the ambit of Article 21. So, and multiple PIs were filed by social activists, by conscious citizens, and Justice Bhagwati and Krishna are literally created a new and vast and exciting area of jurisprudence called the PIL jurisprudence, which I'll talk about later. Then the Visakha guidelines, which mandates that every organization, right, needs to have a policy on sexual harassment, needs to have a committee, and again would urge all of you to read the Supreme Court Visakha guidelines. Again, a classic example of stepping in when the government failed. Judiciary had to step in. Judiciary had to articulate these guidelines because government was not forthcoming, and to protect the dignity of women, to protect the and to create a safe working space for the women, the judiciary had to step in. Now, now let me cite a few more examples of judicial activism. Okay, I will call it judicial overreach rather, because as I've said, even when the government has failed, I think for the judiciary to have encroached upon the territory of the legislature or the executive is a very dangerous slippery slope, right? And this is why I cite a few examples of or a few instances of judicial activism, which I will call judicial overreach. One is the ban on Deepavali firecrackers, citing the rising pollution level and to safeguard the environment. Banning the use of private vehicles, which are over 10 or 15 years, right? Depending on whether they are for commercial use or private use. Monitoring police investigations in various crimes. That is not the role of judiciary. Judiciary at best should have, stepped in only after the charge sheet or the police investigation was completed. That's when the judiciary comes into the picture. But oftentimes, judiciary has directly monitored police investigation uh, um, the uh, declaration of the National Judicial Appointment Commission (NJAC) Act as unconstitutional, thereby depriving the legislature or the executive any role in the appointment of judges. I think that is again judicial overreach. India is the only country where the judges appoint judges, or the judges solely appoint judges, through the collegium system. Uh, Ban on the, and I think this was very controversial. Ban on sale of liquor within a few 500 meters of the national or state highway, right? So the Supreme Court, I think, a couple of years back, had directed that no liquor outlet could be present within half a kilometer, which was, I think, one of the most absurd judgments. Uh, Visaka guidelines we have spoken about, right? Though the intent of the judiciary or the Supreme Court was not to be doubted or can't be doubted, but I think it seriously undermined the authority of the parliament in this case. Uh, the Supreme Court, setting up the Lodha panel to probe the allegation of corruption and match fixing in cricket. Again, something which the judiciary is not competent enough to adjudicate on. It's a very technical matter, so I think the judiciary shouldn't have gone there. Yes, we know that there were scandals in BCCI. There were a lot of scandals in the way the Indian cricket administration was being run. But interference by judiciary, I think, was uncalled for. Interference in the running of educational institutes or in dictating the educational policies of the government. Again, I think was going too far. Sealing of unauthorized commercial operations. Uh, these are just a few examples that I've cited to stress how the judiciary has often overstretched its powers. Now, let me read out four classic or landmark cases where the judiciary again has gone too far. One, I have already spoken about the bursting of fireworks during Diwali. This is Arun Gopal versus Union of India 2017 judgment, where the Supreme Court fixed the timings for bursting of Diwali firecrackers and prohibited the use of non-green fireworks. Although there are no laws, in our statute books to that effect. Right. In 2018, in MC Mehta versus Union of India, the Supreme Court annulled the rule of the Central Motor Vehicle Rules 1989, where it directed that no BS4 vehicles should be sold after 30th of March 2020. Okay. And it also ordered that no 15-year-old petrol-driven or 10-year-old diesel-driven vehicle would ply in Delhi. Okay. And I directed the NGT and I directed the Delhi government to impound such vehicles, right, post the deadline. In another highly controversial judgment in Syamal Narayan Chokshi versus Union of India, the Supreme Court had made it mandatory to play national anthem in all the cinema halls in India before the feature film starts. I think the Supreme Court has no business. The Supreme Court has no business directing citizens to wear their patriotism on their sleeves. I think this was highly uncalled for. Now I would call this judgment by the judiciary or government by the judiciary or by the judges. So is this government by the judges legitimate? Now I would leave this open for all of you to answer, but certainly I would be it would be fair on my part to speak of some of the pros of judicial activism. I have spoken about some of the cons, like the violation of the separation of power, its tyranny of the unelected. Late Arun Jaitley had very famously said that judiciary stepping into making public policy is tyranny of the unelected. We are a democracy. The elected MLAs and MPs and the PRA members who are supposed to play that role. The judges are not accountable to the public. They're not accountable to the voters. So it's really the tyranny of the unelected. And also because our constitutional courts, the Supreme Court and the High Courts, they have, they are the court of record. So any judgment or any order or any direction by these courts, so the constitutional courts, are precedents. They are standard precedents for other cases. Okay, so that also has to be kept in mind when discussing the judiciary's involvement in public policy making. But I think I have already said that when the two theories of judicial activism, the theory of social want and the theory of vacuum filling, these two theories. So these two theories, I think, speak of the positive aspects of judicial activism. Um, uh, so basically, it's like to protect the fundamental rights of the citizens. It's basically to protect the constitutional values, to ensure that there is no misuse of power by the executive or the legislature, and also to ensure that the executive or the legislature are performing their duties which they are tasked with. So these are the pros. Now how does judiciary indulge in judicial activism? You might ask. Okay, so there are various ways. At least the Supreme Court of India is all powerful. They can call for through the use of Article 32 and various other tools. They can call for any legislation to be scrutinized. But the two most important ways or the platforms to which the judiciary indulges in judicial activism is PIL, which public PIL stands for public interest litigation, and the second one is judicial activism. Judicial review. So PIL is a wonderful innovation, and in the US you have the class action suit. It's something similar to that. Typically, one can approach the courts only when one is an interested party. Okay, but what we call the locus standi. What locus standi do you have to initiate a case? Right? But in the case of PIL, this traditional rule of locus standi is relaxed. Okay, so on behalf of the citizens or of a class of citizens, and when the public interest is involved, I can file a PIL. I can go to the court, the constitutional courts, the high courts, and the Supreme Court, and seek relief on behalf of a class of citizens, right? So MC Mehta and few other environmentalists, they filed PIL stating that industries in and around Agra are affecting the beauty of the Taj, and so they should be relocated. Okay, so Supreme Court said yes. PILs were filed on behalf of bonded laborers. PILs were filed on behalf of pavement dwellers in Mumbai. So there are hundreds of PILs which have really expanded the jurisprudence in our country. And I think as students of public policy, it would be pertinent for you to go through some of the landmark PILs and see how the Supreme Court has really provided relief in ensuring that the rights, the fundamental rights, okay, largely Article 21. Again, most of these PILs revolved around Article 21 because Article 21, prior to the PIL jurisprudence, prior to Justice Bhagwati and Justice Krishna Iyengar's intervention, focused on only whether someone can be killed, okay, or someone can be deprived of his or her life and liberty. But post that, the Supreme Court read multiple rights into Article 21, so much so that Article 21A had to be incorporated. Right to education. Government said no. If someone is not educated, then what kind of life is that person going to have? So you have to ensure that that person gets at least free and compulsory education up to the age of 40. So right to education was incorporated. You have to ensure that that person has basic minimum income, right to life, livelihood. right to shelter, right to, and now right to privacy has also been incorporated into Article 21, okay, in the Aadhaar judgment. So PIL is one of the tools uh, for the judicial activism. And the second tool is the tool of judicial review. Okay, so the judicial review is the doctrine under which the legislative and the executive actions are subject to review by the judiciary. As I've said, the judiciary has the power to review every single action, every single uh, legislation uh, enacted by the legislature and executed by the judiciary. Now, and then if the judiciary finds that this executive or the legislative actions are incompatible with the constitutional norms and values and constitutional mandate, that it can annul that act. Okay, judicial review is part of the basic structure uh, as articulated in Kesavanand Bharati 1973, and because it's part of the basic structure, no government can amend and do away with this doctrine of judicial review. So judicial review is an unamendable part of Indian Constitution, and is widely exercised by the judiciary in multiple judgments. Uh, uh, now the scope of judicial review is to examine a policy. Oftentimes, people have approached the Supreme Court and various high courts to challenge the validity of various policies. The CAA judgment, sorry, the CAA Act, Citizens Amendment Act, has been challenged. It's still pending in the court. The abrogation Article 370 has been challenged, still pending in the Supreme Court. So there are many ways where the judiciary can exercise its power of judicial activism, but these are the two most popular and widely used tools. Now I'll conclude by saying that in the garb of judicial review, or in the garb of providing relief and solace to the citizens, the Supreme Court cannot usurp on the jurisdiction and the decision-making power of the executive or the legislature. Right? That is not what our Constitution or the founding fathers or Constitution mandated. Right? And in the garb of judicial review and in the garb of PIL, the Supreme Court should not disturb or interfere with any of the policies unless they are grossly irrational, they are arbitrary, they are violative of the principles of natural justice. The Constitution clearly stipulates separation of power, and the Supreme Court should not and cannot usurp the jurisdiction of the decision makers in the garb of judicial review. And the Supreme Court itself has said this in many verdicts in judgments, right? So I'll rest my case. I think it's an interesting topic. It provides a lot of food for thought for policymakers. I see a lot of administrators here, a lot of people from various walks of life. But I think it it should definitely trigger more discussion as to how that fine balance between the powers of the three organs of government can be maintained, right? Right? And judicial imperialism, should not. I'm not saying that there is judicial imperialism, but judicial imperialism, for that matter, there should not be legislative imperialism or executive imperialism either. But judicial imperialism without political accountability is certainly something which our founding fathers did not have in mind. So thank you. I think we can have Q&A, and I would love to hear your views on this topic, because I'm still learning about this topic and still formulating my thought process. Thank you.
I think, as mentioned by Nikhat in the chat. One of us needs to moderate the question answer session. So I'll request if CR is there, if he can coordinate that. Pankaj, are you there? Otherwise, I can take up the role if it suits everybody else.
Yeah,
Take it, Sudhanshu, please.
please,
So-
please.
Please take it.
So thank you, sir, for this this time and this lecture on a very interesting, and I'm sure there will be a lot of debate and questions. So let me start by one of the points raised by one of our colleagues, that is Shahid. And his question is in the chat, sir, if you can refer to that, otherwise I'll read it out. Shahid, sir.
I think this is judicial activism from two standpoints. Number one, when the judiciary brings in its own personal view in the judicial decisions rather than the prevailing law of the land, where judiciary tries to protect individual fundamental or human rights, which the legislature is not taking up because of popular opinion. Example, decriminalization of homosexuality. Right. Right. I think the first point which Sahid has raised, that applies not only to judicial activism, but that applies to, that is the general role of judiciary. Right. The judiciary is supposed to be unemotional and they are, because it's an adversarial system, right? So the two opposing parties bring in their points and their issues, and based on the law and the facts, the judges have to take a stand, right? So there is no role for any personal view in judicial decision making. Okay. So it's obviously it has to be the law of the land, whether you apply the the constitution, which is the supreme law of the land, or the statute books, the Indian Penal Code or any other act or rule. It has to be an unemotional and uninvolved and impersonal approach. So I think that's certainly the case. Now again the second point, yes, 377 decriminalization of homosexuality, 377 IPC. Yes, I personally think that that was very much necessary. I was very much against criminalization of homosexuality. I have personally written about it and also strongly supported the activists who were pursuing this in the Supreme Court. But again, as I've said, institutions and structures are important. They will outlive all of us. So where do you draw the line? Because it's a very dangerous slippery slope. Where do you draw that line? So here it has worked out well, right? But I think what was probably necessary was to educate our lawmakers. I think the pressure should have come from our voters, right? I think the various political parties should have engaged in a debate, and I think it was for the parliament to enact a legislation decriminalizing homosexuality rather than for the Supreme Court to do so. So again, I feel that in this particular instance, it has been a very positive aspect of judicial activity, but it has damaged the
So I hope, Shahid, that answers most of your points. Now I see a few raised hands here, so I'll start with what appears on my screen. So Pankaj A, you go first, then Rajiv, and then Jaspreet, in that order, and then we'll follow up Kanika with you, and also I can see Rishi. So go ahead, Pankaj A.
Okay, thanks, Sudhir sir. It's a very interesting topic that you touched upon, although I am not very familiar with the judicial aspect of the how the judicial functionary happens in the Supreme Court and the High Court. But as a layman, as a common man, my observation is that, the first point that Shahid pointed out about the personal view in judicial decisions. It's very interesting to note that whenever there are, bench judges have a bench of either 5 judges or 7 judges, and then at the end of it, the judgment is always like the 3 judges have some view, and then 2 judges have their own view. So as a common man, it has always been very interesting to note for me, because if everything is black and white, and if the case has been, all the proofs has been put on in the court by the investigation team, and still some judges have divergent views in a bench. So that's an interesting point, and that makes me realize that there's definitely something else, which is, definitely some personal view plays a role over there. That's one thing. Second part is the judicial activism. The judiciary, we have seen they have, very strong opinions about everyone, either the legislature or through all other parties in the democracy. But somehow there has to be some, there are no strong opinions, no activism done by judiciary for themselves. We have seen from years and decades cases going on. Never seen any politicians, being finally given some verdicts. And we have also seen cases wherein judiciary people who are judges having after retirement taking up positions either through governmental pressure. So there is definitely some linkages. It seems that the judiciary is not holier than society. There is definitely some. It's not untouched. So I think from judicial accountability point of view, some activism needs to be shown from judiciary itself. You touched upon the collegium part. But yeah, just wanted to have your opinion on how this accountability can be looked upon.
Right. I think very interesting points, Pankaj. You spoke about the split verdict. Well, let's say there's a 7-judge bench. So, and 4 judges are of a particular view, and 3 judges are of a separate view, a diametrically opposite view. But because majority rule prevails, so by a 4-3 judgment, the judgment is passed. But it was just 4-3. It could have been the other way, right? So I think that's how it is. That's how it is in a bench. Unless it's a single judge, if it's a 3-judge bench or 5-judge bench, it's always by the majority. And judges are also human beings. They come from the same society that we come from. They have their own views. They formulate their views by reading the same newspapers and portals and watching the same TV channels that we do. So they have their strong views on everything, right? I'll give the example of the famous Sabarimala judgment, right? If where women devotees of a particular age are between 15 and 50 are not allowed to enter the sanctuarium of the temple, Lord Ayappa. Now I don't have a view on this, but in a 4:1 verdict, the Supreme Court had allowed women to enter the temple of Lord Ayappa, and the lone dissenting view came from a lady judge. 4 male judges held that yes, it's about women empowerment. It's patriarchal not to allow women to enter the temple. It's regressive, it's superstitious. So yes, women should be allowed of all ages, of all age groups, to be allowed entry into the temple. And the only dissenting voice came from a lady judge, right? So it's not always black and white. There are subjective views, unless, in most criminal cases, yes, you have the facts and you have the law and you can apply. But there are a lot of cases, particularly constitutional matters and even criminal cases where, uh, different judges interpret differently. Like, after all, it's about human interpretation. It's not a machine which is interpreting the fact and the law. It's they go through all the documents placed before them. They listen to the arguments made by the councils, and then they form a view, right? Oftentimes those views are overruled and challenged in the Supreme Court, and oftentimes they have been overturned, right? Or if not, they have been then reviewed by a much larger bench many years later. Many years later, right? So it's a process. I think that's fair. I think otherwise we need not have judges. We can have computers. We can have AI. We feed all the data, and then the computer can take a call on that. But no, I think that's probably not ideal. Now, coming back to your second point about judicial accountability, yes, I very strongly feel that the judges need to be judged. Today they are judging everyone. Today they are passing strictures on everyone, but themselves. And the tragedy is that removing a judge, at least of the Superior Court, the High Court or the Supreme Court, is such a tedious process that probably will never happen. Impeachment is the only way a judge of a Superior Court can be removed. And till date, no judge in 75 years of our existence has ever been impeached. Though we have had instances of bad behavior by many instances of bad behavior by judges of High Courts and Supreme Court. Right. As I've said, the collegium system is so opaque. It's so incestuous. You have 10 families dominating the judiciary in every High Court, in every state in the country. I come from a family of lawyers, and I'm a lawyer myself now, practicing in the Supreme Court and Odisha High Court. So I can tell you, in every High Court, there are 10 families dominating the bench, judiciary. And you have dead sons and daughters and nephews and nieces, becoming judges in future, right? So no one knows how judges are appointed. No one knows. No one knows how the collegium picks and chooses names to be appointed to the High Court. So this is where the NJSC was, I think, a beautiful piece of legislation. Overwhelmingly passed by both the houses of parliament, had support across all political parties, was passed by over 2/3 of the state assemblies. Still, it was, declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. God save this country, because you can't criticize the judiciary because they have this very powerful tool of contempt. That is another tragedy, the power of contempt. You criticize the judiciary, they can invoke the power of contempt, and they sit on judgment over whether it was contemptuous or not. So I think good points.
Thank you, sir. I think Rajiv, you can go ahead now.
Thank you, Sudhanshu. Hello, Mr. Sridhikumar sir. Thank you. A pleasure talking to you and interacting and getting your thoughts. My observation from what you spoke about, judicial activism and judicial overreach. Don't you think so? This is also happening because somewhere, despite the fact you cited Keshavananda Bharati and the basic doctrine and that the heart, which is the fundamental right, being the heart of the constitution, which cannot be touched upon. There have been assaults which have, which have necessitated the judiciary to come in and intervene on behalf of the common man. Like, for example, the recent, just 4 days back, I was reading that, the administration in Mathura has put a ban on the sale of meat and alcohol. Now, I don't know whether going by if we don't want a judiciary to intervene, was there a political debate on it? Was there any consensus, public consensus taken whether this kind of wholesale blanket ban is it needed for the community at large? So and then the common man who could be suffering because of this ban has no other option but to kind of knock at the doors of judiciary for relief. So where it's a very thin line, in my opinion, and then I believe that but this has also been necessitated because possibly the legislature is also thinking in a very majoritarian point of view, rather than getting a consensus as to what is wrong and what is right for the common man. Your thoughts on this?
Absolutely, I totally agree with you, Rajiv ji. See, the judiciary started becoming active only because the other two organs failed its citizens, right? Now, whether this particular instance that was cited in Mathura, the ban of liquor and sale of meat, well, that was part of the manifesto of the ruling party. Now, whether it's a right decision or a wrong decision is for the public or the voters to decide. This is why the voters get the opportunity to make a choice every 5 years, right? It's a policy decision, right? Now, one might have strong views. We are a secular nation, it affects the livelihood of several hundreds of people. Yes, true, but that should have been an informed debate on this. The media should have initiated a debate. The challenge in this case particularly is not judicial activism. I'll tell you why. Because the challenge is on the ground that it violates fundamental rights. It violates Article 21, right to life and liberty. Again, livelihood is part of right to life and liberty. And it is challenged on the ground that it violates the principles of secularism, right? Which is part of the basic structure. So yes, in this case, I think the judiciary is well within its umbrella to sit on judgment, but to mandate that you need to stand up before every film show when the national anthem is being played. Is that the role of judiciary? I mean, we have 3 crore pending cases. The judiciary spends hours and days and such valuable time adjudicating on such trivial issues, which it has no business, right, deciding. Homosexuality, yes, I think all the political parties, in private, the leaders of all political parties, or at least some leaders would agree that, this is a regressive provision in the Indian Penal Code. It was drafted in 1860. We had Victorian morals, then imposed on us by the British. Why should it be there today? We are a nation which gave the world the Kama Sutra. We have, the Khajuraho and the Konark Temple explicitly depicting through sculptures. But should it not have been the role of the legislature to bring in law? That should have been, part of the election manifesto of some political parties. That should have been what, the voters should have demanded from the, we want to see that, within 100 days of you coming to power, you will do away with Article 377. Oh, sorry, Section 377 of IPC, right? Homosexuality, punishment for homosexuality. So, because it didn't happen for decades, it gave a room for the judiciary to step in. Now, my issue is, where do you draw that line? And yes, it's a thin line. It's a thin line, right? Tomorrow, the judiciary, we have several silly judges. Now you have probably read that one judge of a particular high court is arguing that cows they exhale oxygen, okay, and cows should be made a national animal. Is that the role of the judiciary? So that is where the danger lies. That is where the danger lies, and in particular instances, it is absolutely in the interest of the nation, in the interest of the citizens, when the judiciary has made certain guidelines or has passed certain judgments. But it is at a huge cost. It is at the cost of the authority of the parliament. It's at the cost of the authority of the elected bodies. So that is my big worry and my big concern about judicial overreach.
Just please.
Good evening, sir.
Good.
Sir, my question would be pertinent to selectivism in judicial activism. I belong from Punjab and currently serving as ADC. And as far as the judicial activism is concerned, we as civil servants are always been at the receiving end of judicial activism. And my question, but would not be concerning to judicial activism as far as our relationship with judiciary is concerned, but it is more with the selectivity of judicial activism. On one hand, we see number of people applying for bail from a particular state of India, and on the other hand, we see this one celebrity press reporter Arnab Goswami, and he applies for the bail and he is granted the bail. Somehow, the perception among all the people of this nation, it goes that there is a hand in glove kind of a mechanism. Judiciary was known to be, fearless and able to always speak their mind. Why this decline in kind of, being fearless and being proactive more towards the citizen and not towards the party in power?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the fundamental issue of appointment, the judicial appointments. Right? So everyone agrees that the appointments are not the best. There are many deserving lawyers and candidates who are overlooked and not appointed. And as I've said, it's the most opaque body, the collegium system. It's such a funny thing. You have a bunch of judges appointing judges to the constitutional post. No one knows on what grounds. No one can challenge the appointments. At best, the government can sit over the appointment, which it is doing now. It is, and I think that's a way of that's one of the way the current NDA government is giving back to the judiciary for holding the NJAC Act unconstitutional. Now selective activism, yes, absolutely, totally agree with you. Just totally agree with you. It's again, see, part of the answer could be that it's a subjective thing, right? Bail is a matter of discussion. Bail is not a matter of right. Okay, bail is not a matter of right. So the judges have the discussion to grant bail or not. Though there have been multiple judgments of the Supreme Court which has said that bail should be the norm and jail should be the exception. Right? That has been the pronouncement of the Supreme Court in numerous judgments. But it's a matter of discussion. So one judge might perceive that, okay, this particular accused or individual or case should be viewed and bail should be provided. Some other judge might have a different view. So I'm not going into a specific instance. In this case, you spoke about Mr. Goswami, but yes, I think bench hopping. Bench hopping is another favorite term used in the legal fraternity. People wait. We do wait for the most conducive judge to take up the matter, because we know that if Mr. X hears the matter, then there's no chance we'll get the bail for our clients. And if Mr. Y takes up the matter, then for whatever reason, he or she is most likely to grant bail. So bench hopping is a serious issue. I think it's high time there has to be accountability for the judiciary. It's high time that the appointment system of the judges to the Supreme Courts, the High Courts and the Supreme Court should be rethought of. And yes, absolutely. A lot has been written on these aspects, but again, as I said, people are scared. People are scared of taking on the judiciary because of the power of contempt which the judiciary has. So I don't know what the solution, but I think debate and discussion and more and more awareness, more and more such debates are required across the country. That's how things change.
Thank you, sir.
So very nice and very candid of you to express the views and points. Now I'll move on to Kanika, though she's also for the paucity of time or for in the interest of time management, put the question in the chat box. But Kanika, you can go ahead, introduce yourself and speak your question out.
Okay. So good evening, sir. I come from the private sector, and very enriching to hear your views on the judicial activism, especially for us. We don't think to fit like that at all. My question very simply is that, in a sense, using the lingo of the course that we are in, you refer to externalities which are positive as well as negative. Vishakha guidelines in terms of the activism is positive. However, the Choksey case that you refer to, sort of can tread on the line of not so positive or perhaps even negative, subject to interpretation. So the question really is that, to mitigate the dangers of overstepping in that sense with this activism, what are the top 2 or 3 suggestions that you may have as a sitting MP to bring in the policy makers' perspective really?
Right. I think very interesting, relevant question, Kanika. I think first and foremost, we need to choose our politicians wisely. See, the judiciary would never have had the need to be active or to indulge in overreach had the parliament and the assemblies done the job, right? So when the parliament and the assemblies were found lacking, they were found there was policy analysis, or there was uh, not enough, or when they were found to be trampling on the rights of the citizens, the judiciary found a window to get it. Okay, so first and foremost is for the and again this has been said millions of times that we deserve what we get what we deserve. So we need to clean our political system. We need to have more young people, more educated people come into politics. We need to ensure that the politicians do their job. I'll give you a personal example. During every session of parliament, we get, trust me, I'm not kidding, I'm not exaggerating. We get at least half a truck load of materials and documents to study, which is humanly impossible. So most of the MPs don't read the bills that are to be discussed or debated in the House, because it's impossible. So there are organizations now, they summarize these bills, the PRS does that, and a few others. So what they do is and I would strongly request Bharati School also to play a major role here. They simplify these bills for the MPs and organize briefing sessions and orientation sessions for the MPs to introduce these bills, to educate them on these bills. But barely 2, 3, 4, 5 MPs go for this briefing session. So that is the seriousness with which the MPs look at these parliamentary discussions. So first and foremost is for the parliament and the state assemblies to take up their jobs and responsibilities seriously. Here the voters have to play a role, and this is the age of social media. So social media should question how many, why is my MP not attending parliament regularly? Why, how many questions has he asked? What are the bills that he has spoken on or she has spoken on? Or, so, I mean, you go to PRS website, everything is there. You go and search for any MP, any MP's performance, and you have a summary, you have a detailed report on the number of 0-hour questions he has asked, number of, start or unstart questions he has asked, number of private members bill, if any, he or she has introduced. So that is for the voters and the general public. Second, I think is more such a discussion, because today, the judiciary has the final word, right? So what do you do when the judiciary itself is at fault and it's largely unaccountable? Then what do you do? Impeaching the judges is impractical. So I think discussion, debate, and such public orientation, such events are highly necessary. Because I think every university campus should be organizing such debates and discussions on how to make the judiciary more accountable, how to make the judiciary be less selective in its activism, yes, and how to make the legislature and the executive play their role so that the judiciary doesn't get a window to step in. I think this would be my suggestions.
So before I go on to Rishi next, there's a question by Mr. Vinay Kumar, one of our senior colleagues. In the text box, sir, if you can see, otherwise I'll read it out also. It
Right.
says, when do we, sir, please.
Yeah. I think it's very, very, very interesting because this has been a long overdue thing. I think this All India Judicial Service. I think you have the IAS, the IPS, IFS, and pretty much every other sector has been covered through an All India or the central services, but not the judicial services. I think that should be that again also connects to what Kanika had asked. I think pressure should be built on, and I think I would urge all of you to put pressure on your MPs. And this is the role of the Rajya Sabha, because Rajya Sabha has the power to create an All India service, not the Lok Sabha. Only Rajya Sabha under Article 312, I think, has the power to create an All India service. So send letters to all the Rajya Sabha members, demand from them why have you not introduced a bill to create an All India judicial service. So I think best minds will enter the judiciary if we do this, and over the long run, it won't happen overnight. It won't happen in a month or two, or even in a year or two. But over the long run, I think that will clean up the judiciary also, and more efficient, more talented young people will be interested to get to the judiciary. Right? So I think yes, certainly, Vinayji, I think it's a very uh, pertinent question that you asked. Please, pursue this. If you can take the lead, and the Bharati school can take the lead in this, I think that will be a great service to the country.
Thank you, sir.
Would you like to add anything, Vinayji? Anything you want to add to this?
Only, sir, I want to add that already I think the government of India is in a process, and it is long due. I think more than 8 to 10 years back, the letters were sent to all the state governments. Barring few state governments, they have responded positively. Now the reasons are obvious that why many states have also said negative to that. But the latest information I have is that there is some exercise going on at the government of India level. Some bill is being prepared and also maybe you will be knowing it better. I don't know.
No, you're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Four state governments are opposing it.
Yeah.
And few high courts have as well, because high courts have also been asked for their views. And there are few high courts who do not want to have, and that is understandable. As I've said, that is understandable. The judicial community will never want its power to be diluted, right? So they will never want this, and then they use the fancy words or like encroachment on the independence of judiciary, violation of the principles of separation of power, executive interference in judiciary. So these are all delaying tactics. I think the time it's long overdue, and I think if you have rightly said, it's under serious consideration of the government, and there will be for some states, some high courts will always oppose it. So be it. It's a democracy. People have the right to oppose. But if it's in the interest of the nation, if most of the states and most of the MPs want it, then it should see the light of the day.
So Rishi, you're next, and sir would like to know how much time we have. Another 5-7 minutes before we close. Sir. How much time do you have, sir? We wanted to know that. Sir.
I was told I should be available until 7:30, so that gives another 14, 15.
Right. Yes. Yeah, Rishi, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. It was such an enriching session. And I would want to go back to the issue of judicial overreach, or I would call it adventurism in a way. Like we discussed the case of this cow to be national animal. Similarly, in August only, we saw Guwahati High Court actually, they granted bail to a rape accused, whatever the merits must be there. But they also observed that, he's an asset to the nation because he was an engineer. So, courts making such statements. So what do you think is driving the courts? Is it some angst, or courts are thinking that, they are the custodian of the values in the country, or is it just playing to the gallery? What do you think is driving the courts? Yeah.
Sorry. I
Thank
didn't
you,
want
sir.
to-
Thank you. No, I'm done. Thanks.
Right. I think it's the last observation that you made, playing to the gallery. See, I have a lot of friends in judiciary, in those judiciary, of course, and few friends who are now judges in Odisha High Court. Friends, colleagues, and so the judges, they are not allowed to interact with the media, right? It's there is no bar per se, but it's like a unwritten rule. They do not socialize much, right? And they can express their views only through their judgments, right? As they say, a judge is defined by his or her judgment. So a judge is not expected to write an opinion piece in Hindustan Times or an editorial in Times of India. So they can articulate their views or their preferences only through their judgments. And sometimes, some judges take it too seriously. They 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 uh, they want to be populist, and sometimes they miss silly and absurd comes. So which is very unfortunate, of course.
So Avinash, you had your hand up earlier. You still have your question?
Uh, uh, Good evening, sir. It was so nice to hear from you. We keep on hearing you in Odisha, but since you have raised a very pertinent question, we never thought the things in that way to go. So I would like to share an anecdote wherein some years back I was heading a branch in one of the semi-urban place. So it happened that one of the SDGM was he became a good friend of mine, and he used to call me when my branch was closed, since the judges they couldn't interact with normal public or even the bureaucrats and to anyone, and he used to come to my place, the branch of mine when shutter was down, and hope these things is not recorded. So I'm making a statement. And when there was some cases there at the police stations and all, they used to pass on very relevant things, and they used to discuss what the things to be raised and what is not to be raised, and how they would take it up and what are the things to be done. So from that day, it was a suspicion in my mind that in what way judiciary is going. And even in some days back, when we read that some Supreme Court judge, he was at the bench, and he even gave a testimony against the country in case of Vijay Mallya, as you are aware of it, that his life is not safe at India. So as you rightly pointed out, it makes me to think that where is that line? Where is the thin line? And how to decide that this is the line and wherein judiciary has to come in, and this is the line where judiciary has not to come in. As you have rightly pointed out and clarified many of my colleagues' question that political parties and even these current legislators have a very pertinent role to play. So I would like to know your views, sir. So can we draw a line somewhere, and how to know and how to go about this?
I think I've already said this, Avinash. Again, everything goes back to the kind of the kind of people who get appointed to particularly the superior judiciary, right, to the superior courts, because and it's very and the reason why I keep harping on the high courts and the Supreme Court and less on the trial courts, though the trial courts are as important as the Supreme Courts, is because the judgments of the superior courts, the high courts and the Supreme Court, they have precedent value, so they can be cited in future judgment, in future arguments, or in other cases, okay, and they are courts of record, right? So and that becomes the law of the land. whatever the Supreme Court courts tell us becomes the law of the land, right? Until it's overruled by another superior court or by a larger bench or something like that. So the other aspect is regarding socialize. There are many countries, for instance, in the UK, judges are allowed to socialize. The judges do socialize. I think they are human beings after all, right? They are human beings. So if they are not supposed to go to any party, or if you're not supposed to attend any wedding or mix with the common citizens, that definitely has a psychological impact. I think so. I really think. Anyway, they are in today's world. One gets to know everything. The idea was that because this again goes back to the colonial times. Why judges do not socialize goes back to the colonial times. The idea was that judges should be uninfluenced by what the society thinks regarding a particular matter or a case. Okay, so let's say there is a pending case about a murder or a rape trial. Then if the judge meets people, then he might get influenced by the views of others, right? And that was the logic. I mean, that logic doesn't stand anymore. So yeah, they are social beings. They're product of the same society that we all come from.
So, there's one more question by one Mariko Barua in the chat box also.
Yeah.
Pankaj, your hand is up. Do you still have a question?
If the time permits, sir.
Yeah. Okay.
Later on, after Mariko.
Yeah, after Mariko, one question, and then I'll request
sure.
Vamshi. Another, sir, you must be aware we have a member of Legislative Assembly, an elected member in the group. So
I was not aware of it.
So I'll request him to wrap up from our participant side and also propose a vote of thanks in the end.
So do you want me to take up Mr. Mariko's?
Yeah, I'll take. She's one of the young, very.
Oh, it's a she. Okay.
Yes, a very enthusiastic partner in the group. I'll just read out, while judiciary, in fact, a very interesting question on the post retirement, which all of us bureaucrats also look for. While judiciary is supposed to function independently and impartially, post-retirement, they seem to be having a political bent, especially with Ranjan Gogoi's nomination to the Rajya Sabha. Wondering, what do you think of such judgment, since this is the first time?
It's not the first time. It's actually the third time. Justice Ranganath Mishra also was appointed to the Rajya Sabha by the Congress Party in 1993. Right, and prior to him, there was one more person. It's keeping my mind. So I think it's unfair. It's unfair to single out Justice Ranjan Gogoi. Yes, I think he shouldn't have taken it. After serving as the Chief Justice of India, Rajya Sabha is too small a perk or too small a post-retirement benefit. Yes, I think there should be some rule because this is where the conflict of interest lies. Most judges, particularly of the Supreme Court, they look for rehabilitation in some tribunal or some committee or some commission or politics. Yes, this is an exception. Rajya Sabha is an exception. But because of this, they do want to keep the government of the day in good humor. And there were allegations of particularly the last 5-6 years, we have heard of the complicity between the government of the day and the Supreme Court. A lot of and again, I don't have a view on this. It's the perception or the allegation that many judges who had excellent relationship with the BJP, the NDA government, and they didn't want to rub the government the wrong way, because they are looking for some kind of chairmanship or some kind of tribunal appointment, which I think is a serious concern. I think there should be some bar on this. I completely agree with Mariko on this, that this is a very unhealthy, very unhealthy practice. I think there is a cooling off period in the case of bureaucracy. At least there is a cooling off period of 1 year. if I'm not mistaken, Sudhanshu ji, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But you have a cooling off period of 1 year or 2 years, right? But in the case of judiciary, there's none. So I think that shouldn't be allowed. If the constitution doesn't allow them to practice after having served in the Supreme Court, how can they become a member of a tribunal or a chairman of a tribunal or a chairperson of a commission? I think this should be seriously addressed.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Pankaj, very quickly, and then Vamshi, sir.
Yes, sir. Sujit, sir, I was going through your Wikipedia page and I found a connect. I think it's written that you have worked for Infosys in your earlier
long
back. I worked for Infosys as well before, and then you shifted to UNDP sometime.
Right. Well, I have had a very very unusual career. I'm an engineer turned lawyer. In between, I worked for UNDP, I worked for the World Economic Forum, I worked for the US government. So it has been a very diversified career for me. But I was with Infosys between 98 to 2002.
That's great to know, sir. In fact, I mean, since I've worked for Infosys, I'm also currently working with World Food Program. And and the question that I want to ask is actually not something judicial, because it's a rare occasion for me to be having this opportunity to interact with someone sitting in the parliament. So I will ask a political question indeed. From Odisha perspective, like Biju Janata Dal has been in power from like it's been for so long, and as a person sitting out from a state other than Odisha, it's the only state which has been silently working. I mean, there's not many controversial news coming out of it from Odisha, and we have also seen the handling of cyclones. I mean, it's all like positive news coming out from Odisha, and related to sports infrastructure. I have heard like lots of things happening in Odisha. So, is Biju Janata Dal planning to go out of Odisha sometimes as a political party, and what is it working out for BJD?
No, our CM, Honorable CM Navin Patnaik has very categorically said it multiple times that he wants to serve only the people of Odisha, and he has no national ambitions. So BJD is a regional party, restricted to the geographical boundary of Odisha. We have no plans to go outside the state. Now, coming back to the point of silently working, yes, BJD has been in government in Odisha since 2000, uninterrupted. So this is the 5th term of the government in Odisha. And people who are aware of the state will attest, I might sound a bit biased because my party is in government, but truly it has been a remarkable success story in the last 20 years. Odisha is, and we love saying this, Odisha is India's best kept secret, but it shouldn't remain a secret forever, right? So, but truly, lot of transformation is happening in the state. I would urge all of you, being students of public policy, to study the great work happening in the field of women empowerment, in the field of sports infrastructure, sports support, in the field of disaster management, in the field, I mean, you name it, pretty much. See, pre-2000, Odisha with Bihar and Chhattisgarh were at the bottom of almost every socio-economic indicator or parameter, right? Today, we are definitely not at the top. I wouldn't say we are as good as the developed states, but we are definitely not at the bottom. We are definitely in the top 10 or in almost every socio-economic indicator parameter. Almost, if not. So, and development is a process. It's an ongoing process. 20 years is too short a time to completely transform a state, but we are in the right direction. But thanks for the comment. Thanks for the compliments. Pankaj, thank you.
Vamshi, sir. Unmute yourself, please.
Good evening, Sujit sir.
Good evening, good.
Sir, I have a small query. I don't know whether I can ask you here or not. With the social media being so active, rampant, organized, and vindictive, when one approaches the judiciary for a relief, the courts say that it is freedom of speech, and they don't entertain such pleas. And recently there was a small issue in Andhra Pradesh. Some people commented on the judiciary, and they were all taken to task by CBI and Supreme Court and High Court and everything. Is freedom of speech not the same for everybody, every citizen, as good as for the judiciary?
Freedom of speech is a very good question, Dr. Vamsi. Freedom of speech is a fundamental right. Article 19(1)(a) guarantees freedom of speech to every citizen. But it comes with reasonable restrictions. Article 19(2) of the Constitution stipulates the restrictions, right? So Article 19(2) tells you under what circumstances you cannot take the plea of freedom of speech, right? So when it affects the public morality or public order, or when it when it's against the integrity and unity of the country, so on and so forth. So it's not absolute freedom. It's not absolute freedom. Yes, the courts have been more liberal towards and liberal and tolerant towards letting the citizens exercise their freedom of speech.
And they are
But
not entertaining any citizens' pleas, sir.
Right,
Except
but I personally, my strong view is
till
that,
now, I have not heard any plea being entertained by the courts on the same grounds.
right, but then you have the Indian Penal Code. If you write something which is inflammatory, or if you publish a news, if you publish a or if you tweet something or post something on social media which is very defamatory or something which is untrue, then you can be charged under various sections of the Indian Penal Code and the IT Act. So there's nothing wrong with guaranteeing freedom of speech as a fundamental right. I think rather we are way behind the United States. The United States, the freedom of speech is truly, if not, I mean, almost absolute, almost absolute. In the US, you can burn the US flag, and that's absolutely fine. In India, you cannot. In India, you'll be penalized for that. So freedom of speech, I think there's nothing wrong with the freedom of speech, but yes, selective application of that is something which is troublesome. And we did spoke about selective bail application and granting of bail to one particular generation and not to others. But similarly, the courts have oftentimes been, seen granting freedom of speech to some people and not to others. So I think that is true.
So thank you, sir. I think on this note, we'll close the session. I think the talk and discussions have been very interesting. It can go on for hours, but then we have other assignments and timelines.
Right, I have to leave as well.
So, sir, thank you for this speech and this talk, and I wish this could be more offline rather than online mode. And sometimes
I would love to. I'm told you have a beautiful campus in Hyderabad and Mohali. I have not been to your campus. I'd love to physically visit the school. The campus.
Then, sir, from all the participants side, I thank you for your time, and I also thank the ISB and Niket Khalid for organizing this, and thank you all.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.